Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Stephen Marche. Stephen, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Stephen Marche. I'm a Canadian writer, and my latest iteration is I'm the author of On Writing and Failure.
Thank you so much for coming on today. So we're going to be talking about your new book, which I think by the time this goes up will have just published.
It's out.
Okay, it's out now.
Yeah,
Available wherever fine books are purchased.
exactly. Yeah,
On Writing and Failure, and the subtitle is Or on the Peculiar Perseverance Required to Endure the Life of a Writer.
yeah,
And the book is part of the Field Notes series, which is put out by the Canadian publisher Biblioasis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
yeah, that's right.
It's it's an enjoyable book, although parts are dark and depressing. But you keep you keep a good tone throughout, where you're discussing the various frustrations and indignities that a writer, most writers or all writers perhaps, encounter. It's somewhere between a long essay and a short book or pamphlet or
20,000 words.
yeah.
20,000 words. Love that length. If I could write that length, for the rest of my life, like one book a year, I would. It's a perfect length. No one publishes it, but it's a perfect length to write and to read.
Okay, so how did this come together? Did you pitch it? Did they say failure? We need to get Stephen Marche on the line. How did this come together?
Yeah, they said, who knows most about failure? I think it's Stephen. Like, Stephen is most familiar with failure. No, I mean, Dan called me up and he said, we're doing this series. Do you want to write a book in it? And I said, yeah, I want to. And I've sort of kept my whole life, like, not quite a commonplace book, but like a collection of anecdotes about the worst things that happen to writers or like bad scenarios writers found themselves in, just because I found it very comforting. And I found it consoling, and much more so than, stories of writers struggling and succeeding or all the kind of nonsense, pep talk, writer pep talks that people give writers all the time. I found these stories of like how bad it can get to be actually much more consoling. And so I basically put them together in a book and into a book-length essay.
Okay, so what do you see as the connection between writing and failure?
Well, I think there's like writing is actually imbued with failure on a huge number of levels. So like, first of all, there's like the career failure, which is, absolutely part of the process of doing this, and which everyone deals with, and which no one really escapes, even the most successful writers. You are constantly being rejected. And that's just part of the process of doing this. The other thing is that I really have started to realize that, as I wrote the book, that the act of writing itself is mostly you rejecting your own work, right? Like it's mostly about, you write something and then you hate it, and then you throw it away. And then what you don't throw away is in effect what you keep, right? But you're certainly throwing away the vast majority of the things that you write. And so that there's this process of rejection that's actually involved in the act of writing itself. And then I think there's the inherent failure in trying to communicate inner privacies to other inner privacies through language, which is, fundamentally impossible, but also actual. And so, like, to me, failure is like obviously these are a lot of stories about like, James Joyce couldn't get a job at an Italian technical college teaching English. Like that's definitely something that happened to him. But really it's more about how failure is kind of inherent to this process, that you're absolutely never going to escape it in any way. And so you probably shouldn't even try. You should probably just learn to fail with grace.
Do you think failure is more inherent in writing than in other creative arts?
Well, I think there's failure in all creative arts, right? Because you need to get lucky in all of these arts. Like acting, I think, is particularly brutal, where your skill as an actor is more or less irrelevant, right, to what is going to happen to you in your career, and everybody knows it, and it's one of those things where You have to accept that going into it. But on the other hand, I think for acting, you sort of can get to the point where you are a success. And writing, I think the failure just kind of goes on forever. There's always something more to. There's always a point that you haven't reached, and there's always a feeling of being unrecognized, like on some fundamental level. I mean, it was one of those things where I have known some very, very successful writers indeed, and they don't feel that at all. They don't feel a success at all. I mean, and this was just something that I really noticed which was shocking to me, which is like, well, how can you feel this way when you've been on the cover of Time magazine or whatever? But I don't. I genuinely think they don't escape. I don't think anyone does.
Yeah, you relay an anecdote about Jonathan Franzen, who
Well, that's just reported. Like that. I mean, that's not something that I learned. That was just him describing it to Terry Gross, where he's like, I thought I could hand sell a couple copies of Freedom. Like we already sold 1.6 million copies of your last book. I mean, like it's not like you're out there hustling copies on the street. Like you know what
right.
I mean? But he feels that way. And and he is no exception. He is absolutely not an exception. Like that is not at all how I mean, I've known people who, I mean, maybe not as successful as him, but certainly massively successful, feel exactly the same way.
So which way does the causation go? Do you think the type of person who, so to continued being a writer as you write, it's like banging against a locked door or something over and over again, and you might
Yeah.
break through, but you might not. So the only people who sort of ascend to, a level of like cultural influence necessarily have been banging for a long time. Is it that the process, do you think the process makes one like that? Well, or, is there a personality type that can deal with this?
Well, personality type that can deal with it is someone who doesn't really care. And that's not particularly um good for writers. You know what I mean? Like it's definitely there are mental health challenges to any writing career. I think mental health actually, when you look at the statistics, you have to think about um if you're going to write, you have to think about your mental health the way that people who work in lumber yards think about losing their fingers. Right? It's something that you like. It is a risk. You need to think about it, right? You need to actually consider it when you're dealing with it. But whether miserable people are drawn to writing or whether writing makes people miserable, almost impossible to tell,
Hmm.
really. And I think your point where it's just like, well, what kind of leads to the success of these people? Well, I'm not sure in writing you ever know that you're a success, or that you're ever successful for the reasons that you want to be, or that you ever achieve the kind of recognition that you feel you deserve. Right. So I don't think I kind of debate the premise of your question, if you will.
Okay. And so a lot of the book you're giving like sort of capsule biographies of famous writers, many of whom experienced failure or, extreme distress or literal torture. Like
Yeah.
Machiavelli was literally tortured
Yeah.
in his life. And then there's also someone like Melville was like a failure at the end of his life, and no one bought Moby Dick. And then
Yeah.
you mentioned someone I'd never heard of before, Fitz-Greene Halleck, who
Oh,
I
yeah.
guess was a quite prominent 19th century poet of his age, but is now
He has a statue in Central Park. There's a statue in Central Park. Like he has Edgar Allan Poe said he was the poet of his age. Right. And I'm going to tell you, he's actually a very decent poet. Like he's definitely worth checking out. I mean, like in the mid 19th century, definitely he was way bigger than Walt Whitman.
Hmm.
Right. And now there's fashion and eternity as in all things. Right. And I don't think anyone really escapes the just the brutality of fashion. Like it just is one of those things. Like the market needed him for a while and then it didn't need him anymore. And that's really all that there is to it.
Right. Who comes to mind as a who we judge today as a successful writer who had a more or less happy life? Are there, because there's plenty of examples of people who had very unhappy lives, and as you mentioned, a lot of famous writers committed suicide. Are there
Yeah.
ones where you say this was this guy seemed happy most of the time? I mean, I what you mentioned Updike at one point, or a quote from Updike, and he sort of came to mind. Would you
I,
agree with that, or are
I
there other
don't,
ones?
I don't know. I mean, I don't really know who's happy and who's not. I mean, we're living in the social media age, right? It all seems like a big fraud to me anyway, right?
Hmm.
Like you never know who's happy for 5 minutes, really. But but that doesn't, I don't know. I mean, and that also doesn't mean, I think I've certainly met many writers who are deeply self-satisfied, right? They're not the good ones, incidentally, right? Like they're not the ones, like you meet people who think that they are it, right? They are and have done nothing. I mean, that was a sort of lesson from the Hemingway Fitzgerald part of the book, where it's like, Fitzgerald really thought he was a failure, even when he'd written multiple best-selling books. Hemingway had written nothing, but was absolutely convinced of his success. Right. So it's not, it's not super connected to reality, but happiness never is it? I mean, it's never the people. I mean, it's the obvious example, but Anthony Bourdain killing himself, right? Like who had he had the best job in the world,
Hmm.
right? I think you really do, you never know. And external gauges are really a tremendously poor way to tell where someone is at in the state of their life.
Right. Do you think Fitz-Greene Halleck was happier than Walt Whitman? I mean, is there any way to know? Did he write a
I don't
memoir?
know.
Um,
I have no idea of who Fitz-Greene Halleck was as a person. Well, Whitman seemed pretty happy, living in New
yes.
York, sleeping around. I mean,
Well,
like,
I just looked at Fitz-Greene Halleck's Wikipedia page because I never heard of him before, and someone called him the American Byron, but he's of
oh,
interest.
melancholy.
Well, he's of interest, but also I think he was sort of like he slept around as well, and he's apparently of interest today mainly as sort of a another early gay writer or possibly gay writer, and that's
Oh,
one
interesting.
of the few ways anyone studies him. But yeah, so who knows? Okay, there's a kind of book that's like letters to a young ex or something. And this is not this is not that book. But I mean, is this book like a cautionary tale for someone who's like, I want to be a writer someday, and you hand them this book, and they
Well,
they decide to
it
pursue
seems
something else in life?
the kid writers that I know are fully aware of the problem. Okay? Like they're not like, it's not like it's like, yeah, writing's tough. You don't need to tell that to a 24-year. Like they already know. Like
Hmm.
they fully know it. I think the information that I have to communicate that might be useful is that that feeling never goes away. And that you're not going to reach a point where you're like, oh, I've graduated from that suffering, right? Like that's the I think that's one of the purposes of this book, is to explain that it just, that the struggle here, the perseverance required, is not like a dues that you pay and then it's over. Like in fact, it's something that just goes on until I don't know, until you're released from writing, really.
A book that your book reminded me a bit of, thematically at least, is William Derezowitz's "The Death of the Artist," which came out a few years ago, and I had him on this podcast
Right.
actually, and he's
Very
looking,
interesting guy.
yeah, he's looking at the economic changes of the internet age and how that has made it much harder to make a living in the arts at
Yeah.
all. And he focuses on I don't actually know if I think he skips writing because that was like the obvious one to him. But he talks about other arts where it's become much harder to have any sort of like middle class lifestyle in the
Yeah.
arts. Yeah, how do you see that interacting with it? Just
Oh, I think that's definitely true.
the changes of the past 25 years or so.
Well, I mean, we're all living in institutions in radical decline. Like that, I think that much is very clear. Like not just publishing, but media, but also academia, which is in, free fall. Um, like humanistic education is in free fall. Like, I mean, I think I take those points all very well. I will say that I think there was a period after the Second World War where there was a kind of explosion of writing, and there were these explosion of these institutions, and it was sort of not necessarily easy, because I don't think it's easy, but there were jobs like, you could get there were, I remember a world where there were like middle class playwrights who like never wrote hits, but somehow made a living in New
Mhm.
York. Like I met them. Like
Did they seem
that's all
happy?
gone. Oh, they seemed so miserable, although they
Mhm.
had it all,
Mhm.
right? Like, like, but I think we're now returning to more of the historical norm, right? We're returning to the sort of the pre-war period of this stuff, and definitely not in a pleasant way, right? Like this is not a happy eventuality. But on the other hand, we are, it kind of is. This is the way it has always been.
So one of the, I mean, there's the economic changes that the internet has brought, but there's also the way the internet has removed the gatekeepers that once controlled access to like the printing press literally or something. So if you were a no-name
Yeah,
person 40 years ago and you wanted to get your ideas out there, you either stood on the street corner with a loudspeaker or you had to convince someone of your worthiness. I mean, someone with some level of power, like an editor or a radio producer or something like that. So that has
yeah.
really been dismantled, and any person or kook or grifter can now start putting stuff out online, and the algorithm and other strange things bring them to attention. So probably there must be tons, some multiple of more people are like actively writing, for public consumption versus 30 years ago.
I
Um,
don't think so at all.
really?
I seriously. Well, it's a question of like,
Well, it depends what you define as writing, I guess. But if
yeah,
writing a tweet
exactly.
is
But
writing,
tweet is writing, but people wrote diaries before, right? Like if you're talking about professional writers, like people who do it for a living for other people, and when you say the gatekeepers have been disrupted, like no, they've just been changed. Like as you said, the gatekeeper is no longer some guy in an office; it's an algorithm,
mhm.
and I will not, I do not believe for a moment, and nor should you, that is less of a boss, right? But that, like, in fact, it's just as it's worse. It's way worse, right? Like, no. I mean, the idea that we're living in this where anyone can get active, like, no, anyone is allowed to do nothing. Like, anyone is allowed to put their diary online, but that is not the same thing as have an audience, or that's still very much controlled by institutional, frankly, corporate forces. And I just don't think that will ever change. I mean, I just don't like for that to change will require basically a reformulation of society.
Okay. Well, I guess I would push back somewhat. I mean, I don't know how much time you spend on Twitter, and if you are getting any actual writing done, it's
Not
probably
one single work, not one single work of any literary importance has emerged from the entirety of Twitter.
okay. I
Like there is not one single thing on Twitter that is even as valuable as a random Alice Munro story. Like
okay.
it is
You're
of no
probably
value.
right about that, but there's various people who are strange, and 30 years ago they would not have brought their quote unquote work or writing to the public. So one is this guy Cat Turd 2, who started as a Trump reply guy, a huge Trump MAGA fan, and then for some reason Elon Musk like interacts with him a lot. And so this guy, and there was a profile of who he really is. He's basically like a washed up Florida like rock musician in some like, bar band sort of thing. So he is now, I assume, making some sort of living like because of Twitter,
Maybe
because of
something.
print on demand. you know, Maybe Cat Tortu will be the Republican vice presidential candidate as things are going. But this is total like crap garbage. The things he's writing are not going to stand the test of time. But maybe he's like the MAGA, Fitz-Greene Halleck of our current age. And 30 years ago,
No
no
one
one would
on
have.
Twitter has produced anything as good as Fitz-Greene Halleck on Twitter. Not one single person. But also,
But maybe he's
you
making a
say
living
like
doing
it's
this.
the refuge of these, like outsiders, and like that's like Twitter is the refuge of people who follow an algorithm. Like it is not the refuge of anything remotely approaching. Like if you want outsiders, go to New York in 1970 and go to CBGB, where there was like plenty of freaks on display who were making like totally random art, and finding audiences for it. Like Twitter is for followers. Like that is literally what you are there to do. You are literally a follower and a user. So it is, yeah, like the idea that this is some kind of democratic flourishing of arts is like it just does not jive with reality. Like it's just a corporation that that exploits some addictive uses of language to gather attention. Like it has no other value than
Okay, now I am not a fan of Twitter, and I've been rooting for Elon Musk to drive it into the ground for the sake of humanity. So
well,
I agree.
I'm a Twitter addict. Like I use it all the time.
Okay,
But
well,
like
yeah, it's but
you know,
I've used
it
this
is
metaphor before. It's like the alcoholic would be, the neighborhood alcoholic would benefit if the bar got bulldozed, and then he could maybe
yes,
like turn his
exactly.
life around
But
or
I'm
something.
still going to the bar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's
But
how I
I
sort
think
of
it's
view
more
Twitter.
let's not pretend that alcohol is actually a tonic, right? Like let's not pretend that alcohol is actually good for us. Like I may drink it, but like let's not pretend that it's like, the cure. Like that's not what
Right.
it is.
No, it's ultimately excess of alcohol and pretty much any amount of social media is ultimately bad. Okay, but where CBGB, like there's now a target where CBGB is. So where are the freaks
Yes,
of
indeed.
today like accumulating? Like maybe they're on like weirdo websites that we've never even heard of, or maybe they're just playing video games in the basement or something. Like the freaks
They're
are
on
still out there
4chan
somewhere.
doing incredibly disgusting shit. I mean,
Right.
that's like they're on sub forums of Reddit doing incredibly weird and awful things. Like, yeah, that's where they are.
On a different area of this, how do you see the difference in the national cultures of Canada and America, and perhaps England also, in terms of success, failure, esteem? Talking about these things. Like it seems
Are
like
you
America's.
Canadian?
No, I'm American, but it seems like
You're
America
American, right?
is a very we love success in America. That's why we elected Donald
Yes.
Trump. It seems like maybe Canada is closer to the with a closer connection to the UK is there's more of like a performed humbleness or something, whereas that doesn't
Yeah.
fly as well in America.
Well, you see the beautiful thing about America, the thing that is actually the best thing about it is that it's totally okay to be a success there. And everyone loves it. And they want you to succeed. I mean, they want you to that's why everyone I mean, I would not have a career without America, right? Like Canada certainly wanted nothing to do with me, still wants really very little to do with me. And like it is a very I mean, it's a very beautiful part of America that it's okay for people. It's okay to want to be successful. Like I think that's great. In Canada, it's funny. There's an Alice Munro short story collection that had to be renamed when they moved it to America. And I forget what the American title was, but the title in Canada was "Who Do You Think You Are?" Right?
Uh-huh.
And everyone in Canada understood exactly what that meant. Who do you think you are? That's the question that is constantly whispered here. Very much a samey equality for everyone kind of society. Now that has some good parts, right? Like a functioning public education system, a functioning healthcare system, like reasonable laws about guns, etc. Like, but when you're trying to do exceptional things, like Canada will not love you for what makes you exceptional. It just won't, right? It will love you for what makes you normal, which is, not really what writing is about. The Brits, I have a different theory about the Brits that, like, to me, they still have that cult of the amateur. Like, what they want is like to succeed, but just casually.
Hmm.
It's like not a big deal how successful they are. Like they've done this thing, but it's like, well, we just did it for fun. That sort of attitude. It's like a cover for their own success. That's been my experience. Although I've never really worked in Britain.
That's interesting. You mean sort of like toss, like a clever person tossing something off, and but then it's a huge, a huge
Yeah,
thing,
I
and
mean,
they're like, "Oh, that's
when you
nothing."
look at the conservative government, like that's like it's these Eton boys who are like, yeah, so I mean, I can like I'll be prime minister if you like. Do you know what I mean? Like it's an imperialist holdover, right? Like you're not supposed to try at anything. Everything is supposed to come to you very effortlessly. right? And graciously, right?
Mhm.
But that's sort of my I don't that's just sort of my experience with it, really.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, in America, I think the culture valorizes the striver or the
Oh yeah, I
man from
love
the
it.
provinces sort of thing.
It is 100% the best thing. I mean, the other thing about Americans that you just have to love is how they talk, right? Like they just talk frankly and openly about things, and it's just like such a relief when you come from Canada or the UK, where it's just like they will not say what they mean. They just will not. Like you can talk to them for hours, and they just will not tell you what they mean. Right. And if you go to America, it's like, oh, they just like, I've gone into meetings in Canada where I've realized like 2 days later, oh, they didn't want me. They rejected me. Like, but I didn't realize it at the time. Right. And
Mm.
it's like, and it makes life so much harder. It makes life so much harder.
Okay, that's very funny.
Sharing a little of my nationalist pathologies here with you. But that's all right.
So how does the Canadian writers who are successes either in Canada or America or both, how are they viewed nationally? Like Monroe
Well,
or
and I mean, we had kind of like a golden age of writers in the post-war period. So Atwood, Monroe, Ondaatje, um, Leonard Cohen, Mordecai Richler, et cetera. And then some of those. Do you know who Mordecai Richler is? Would that be a name familiar with
I, I
you?
I know I know the name, but I couldn't say anything about him. Was he a poet primarily?
No, he was a novelist,
Okay.
and he was actually a really great comic novelist. But like the only success that matters in Canada is the success in America, 100%.
Hmm.
They would barely even notice the success in Canada. Yeah,
Interesting.
like Alison Monroe wrote for years for Saturday Night and major Canadian magazines, but she wrote for the New Yorker, therefore she matters. I mean, like it's kind of that simple.
Interesting. Okay, let's maybe talk a little bit more about a darker topic, which you mentioned before, which is writers who with mental illness and who commit suicide. And you
Mhm.
write in particular about well, there's a lot to mention, but you write about David Foster Wallace. Um,
Yes, indeed.
and yeah, and there's the stereotype of like the mad genius or something, or someone who is like miserable, a writer who is miserable their entire life, and then finally like succumb to it. But then well, maybe a counterpoint would be like Hemingway, who seemed like very larger than life and happy for most of his life, and then killed himself. Yeah, how do you? Yeah, what I mean, this is a large,
Well,
large
I mean,
difficult topic.
he had some dark spells in there. I mean, like
Mhm.
he had braggadocio, but he definitely had depression. I mean, the thing is, like when you look at Foster Wallace in particular, I think what you see is that he deliberately tried to avoid this mythology of the suicidal artist as valid because he suffered from real depression, so he knew that it was kind of nonsense. But at the same time, he like and the periods where he was at his most productive were for sure the periods where the Nardo was working, where the meds were working. So but the thing that you really learn from him is that the mythology kind of takes over anyway. It's not necessarily that um writers need to have these mental illnesses to write. It's that audiences want them in the grossest way, right? Like in a really debased way. They want these. Suicide makes audiences feel like artists are for real, right? And and I think that's it, like, and that goes for in his case, it wasn't just like the Virginia Woolf literary suicide type. It was the Club 27 rock and roll suicide, which is just equally as horrible and equally as demeaning. But he tried to avoid it his whole life, and he just couldn't in the
Yes, we know more about his particular, the antidepressants he was taking and stuff like that, whereas that didn't exist
end.
for the period of many other famous writers. Yeah, I mean, how do you? Well, it's been 15 years, I think. I think it was 2008 when he died. How and he's I guess the most prominent literary suicide. That's a dubious honor of the past 20 or 30 years. No one else is immediately
Yeah.
come to mind. How do you think, the way the culture has come to view him? I mean, there's this weird sort of like he's one of the toxic male writers, and
Yeah.
puncturing the myth of like that he was some saint or something. I think even Franzen wrote something along those lines, like don't call him Saint Dave or something. Yeah, how do you, 15
Well,
years
I mean,
later, how do you view him?
look, I mean, I don't really wade into these waters very much, but like, you know, I mean, I have a PhD in Shakespeare. If you went through any of those writers and tried to judge their morality as the basis of their art, you would reject everyone, right? I mean, they're they're like, I am not a person who believes that you judge artists on the basis of their moral standing, right? Like that's like to me, their artistic capacities are greater, or and if you do start throwing out writers because of their moral capacities, I mean, you got to sacrifice a lot. I mean, you can't have Picasso, right? Like you can't like he was a monster, right? So like I mean, like I guess I'm just the wrong person to ask that question to because like I've never understood that good art is made by good people. I mean that just seems to me like there's just no evidence. I see no connection between a person's morality and their capacities as an artist, like none, right?
Right.
And so I find that I don't know, just I guess a little naive to me, really.
Right. And I mean, the term that I I don't want to use of like cancellation, which I is complicated and stupid in a lot of ways. But like,
Yeah,
there's no denying that like Kevin Spacey is or was a great actor. And
yeah,
or that Harvey Weinstein was a great producer and knew how to,
true.
take
Yeah,
a movie and make it a hit. But the equivalent of Harvey Weinstein 100 years ago, like those early studio heads did all sorts of horrible things and just it was kept a secret. So that it's easier for these stories to come out now, which is a good thing, I think. So a monster, a criminal like Weinstein can't keep getting away with it. But then you do have to deal with, I think, what do we? I mean, someone who lived 100 years ago was like, yeah, he was a total asshole. He beat his wife or whatever. But the books are still good. The art is still good. You can say that. But then when it comes to contemporary figures, it's much more vexed, I think. And
I don't think art justifies criminality at all. I
Mhm.
mean, I don't think the paintings that Picasso made justify his criminal behavior, even remotely. Like, and I mean, Kevin Spacey should be punished to the max, and Weinstein. Like, of course, these are criminal people. Like, I just think it's, I don't know. I just think there's a certain kind of like reality here um that we have to like if you go through the National Gallery and throw out all the paintings by monsters, like you won't have much left, right? Like the Mort d'Arthur, like all the basis of all the Arthurian legends we have were made by men who committed rape and murder, like Mallory and was
Hmm.
convicted from them and went to jail for it,
Mhm.
right? Like he doesn't get off of jail because he wrote Mort d'Arthur, right? But at the same time, it doesn't invalidate that he wrote Mort d'Arthur. I
Mhm.
like I don't know. I find it. I guess I just find this the approach we have to morality and art to be quite weak. I don't think it's going to last at all. I think it's a very temporary approach to how people think of art and how they think of artists and how they think of what this process is. I mean, as I said, like I don't think art justifies anything. I mean, I think I think it absolutely doesn't. But at the same time, that doesn't that doesn't invalidate the art either, right?
Mhm.
You can't really live that way.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense to me. It is some sort of, emanation of technology changes and yeah, the
Well, I don't think it's even that. I think this has come back and forward lots of times. Like there's been a return to morality in art. There was certainly one in the late 19th century. There was one in the 1920s. There
Mhm.
was like it comes back like this idea that artists should be good people, right? And then you get to other periods where art is supposed to be for bad people, right? Like it's supposed to be the work of scoundrels and people who are marginal and on the outside of society rather than um embodiments of its values. I just, in my own experience, I've just never seen artists as embodiments of societal values.
Right.
Like you would never I just don't think that that's the role that they play in this world.
Right. Okay. We're maybe coming towards the end of our time. Is there anything else about the topic or the book you want to mention?
No, buy it. It's a very interesting. It's an attempt to be cosmopolitan in time and place, and to show how these kind of situations repeat themselves over time, right, and in different places as well. So it's, I mean, like I'd like to think that it took a sort of broader view of this sort of thing.
So a link will be in the show notes to where you can buy the book. And yeah, I enjoyed reading it. I did want to, if we have just maybe a little more time, at least mention you wrote a piece
Sure.
that just came out. The title is, it was in LitHub, on one of the most influential essays of the 21st century of Snark and Smarm. I thought this was quite interesting. We probably don't have time to get into it fully, but I would recommend it to people. I'll include a link to that as well. And yeah, and so you're looking at an essay that Tom Skoka, if that's how you pronounce his last name, wrote about a decade ago on Smarm, was his, which is reacting to
Yeah.
an essay from 10 years earlier on Snark. And
Yeah.
these were sort of two categories of like literary criticism, but also looking at or some sort of a moral evaluation of public life in the like aughts and through the 2010s.
Yeah.
And it's a
Manners,
really
really.
interesting piece that I would recommend people check out.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, yeah. I mean, it was with LitHub, and it's. Skoka's piece is one of those pieces that I've been obsessed with. I mean, I have a great deal of admiration for it while hating it, and that's. I mean, I think that's some of the really interesting work is that way. I mean, it's incredibly well articulated and well made essay, a classic, really. And yet I hate it. So, that kind of tension produces some interesting effects, I think.
Okay, that's interesting. I've gotten this obsession over the past couple of months about Gen Xers moving to the right politically
Yeah.
and in the culture at the same time that Gen Xers are starting to finally take power. And obviously there could be a connection between those two trends, but both of these were sort of like an early Gen X statement and then a later one, but it was very much for like from the outside. And or one was written in The Believer and one in Gawker, and Gawker more
Yeah.
was a very Gen X phenomenon, and was sort of like, we know we're never going to have power, so we're gonna
Yes.
just like tear down
Shit all over it.
the
Yeah.
people who were often boomers, and finally the boomers because of age are receding from the scene, and now Xers are becoming more powerful, and there's Xers on the Supreme Court, and Elon Musk owns Twitter, and he's an Xer. Yeah, and the way that a lot of people who would have and actually this guy Cat Turd too, if you read this profile of him, was sort of like, he was like a rock guy in the 80s and 90s and probably did drugs and boozed a lot, and now he's become like ultra MAGA guy. Anyway, I think this is all interesting.
Well, I mean, rock and rollers always become ultra right. I mean, look at look at the Sex Pistols. Like look at the Smiths, right? Like they people who do rock and roll are inherently conservative. Like all of their rebellions are always a fraud, right? Like because it's not like it's never like it always seems rebellious, but really it's about the tax code, right? That's why the Rolling Stones go to France to make Exile on Main Street so that they don't have to pay taxes. That's why U2, despite all their talk, they moved to Amsterdam and they incorporate there so they don't have to pay Irish taxes. And like rock and rollers are always a fraud, right? Like they always turn out to be frauds. But like they always it always turns out to be just pure narcissism in the end anyway. But I mean, I think one of the things that on Snark and Smarm is like, because of a certain technological route, the usual route of attacking your elders and then taking their place, which has literally been going on for hundreds of years, that kind of got cut off. I mean, one of the things I noticed is that Spy, the book of Spy magazine, like the early years, Spy magazine, yeah, it was published by Miramax, and
really?
Weinstein is thanked in the acknowledgments, right? And it's like that's how satire works, right? It's like satire was like attacking people, but then Weinstein puts it out.
Right.
Right.
Well, Weinstein was an outsider at one point, and that, like the indie movie,
very
it
much
was
so.
the movies that the big studios weren't making, and he like helped lead the revival of indie
Yeah.
cinema. But then I guess whenever the outsider becomes the insider and gains more power, their perspective naturally changes. Yeah, and thinking more about their tax rate, maybe than other
Yes,
things.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I recommend this essay. Links to the things we discussed will be in the notes here. Okay, so you are a Twitter addict, but you hate it. So do you want people to follow you
Yeah.
on Twitter, or are you hoping that the whole thing?
Sure. They can do that. Well, buy the book is what I'd like them to do. But yeah, they can follow me on Twitter at Stephen Marche.
Okay, and
All one
people
word.
can follow me on Twitter at ARYEHCW. As long as it still exists, I honestly think it might really collapse over the next couple of months.
He'll be dead by the time this goes out. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, inshallah. Okay, well, thank you, Stephen, for coming on the book again on writing and failure. And people can rate and review this episode if they enjoyed the content and want other people to find it. Okay, so thanks to all the listeners out there, and we'll see you again next time.